Welcome to WW2 Rewired, a cinematic journey through the untold human side of World War II. Here, we go beyond the battles, beyond the tanks, the generals, the headlines. We uncover the moments when humanity flickered, in the trenches, in the hospitals, in the hearts of those who fought and those who simply endured. Every episode rewires how we see the war, not as history written by victors, but as truth witnessed by survivors. Real documents, real voices, real history brought to life. Subscribe and step into the stories that changed the world. One act of courage, one act of mercy at a time. This is WW2 Rewired, where history breathes again. June 4, 1942. Midway Atoll. The Pacific dawn rises slow and metallic, light bleeding across the endless horizon. On the deck of a PBY Catalina, crewmen blink salt from their eyes, scanning the still silver ocean. The air hums with tension and with engines. Far beyond the coral edge in the deep blue, steel giants drift unseen. Carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the pride of Japan's Kido Butai, cutting westward like silent predators. To the east, two American flat tops, Enterprise and Hornet, wait, their decks already trembling beneath warming engines. Yorktown, hastily patched from the Coral Sea, limps in formation. Radios crackle. The code AF is short of water has already told them what's coming. The ocean, once wide and anonymous, is now a marked battlefield. In just a few hours, the calm of the Pacific will ignite. The tides of war are about to turn, not with numbers, but with timing, courage, and chance. In the early months of 1942, the Pacific belonged to Japan. From the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 to the rapid fall of Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, Imperial Japan seemed unstoppable. Every sunrise brought new headlines of defeat for the Allies. Fortress after fortress falling under the relentless rhythm of carrier strikes and amphibious landings. The Japanese Empire stretched from Burma to the edges of the Central Pacific. It was, by all appearances, invincible. Yet beneath that momentum, Japan faced a problem of its own making: the vastness of the Pacific. It had conquered more than it could defend. To secure its empire, Tokyo needed to draw out and destroy what remained of the United States Pacific Fleet, especially its aircraft carriers. Those carriers, unspared at Pearl Harbor, had become the last mobile spearheads of American naval power. Without them, America would have no way to project air power across the ocean. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Japan's high command sought one decisive encounter, a knockout blow that would crush American morale and secure dominance for decades. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, believed in this decisive battle. His vision lured the U.S. fleet into a trap around a remote island called Midway, halfway between Asia and America. Yamamoto's plan, codenamed Operation MI, was elaborate, too elaborate. It involved multiple task forces, diversions toward the Aleutian Islands and Alaska, and a main strike force built around 4 fleet carriers. The goal: attack and seize Midway Atoll, drawing American carriers into the open to be destroyed by the Kido Butai, Japan's carrier strike force. But there was a problem Yamamoto didn't know. In a basement in Pearl Harbor, a small group of American codebreakers led by Commander Joseph Rochefort at Station HYPO had been listening. For months, they had been intercepting encrypted Japanese naval communications, coded in the complex JN-25 system. Piece by piece, Rochefort's team began to suspect that the next Japanese target was codenamed AF. But what was AF? To confirm they set a trap, the U.S. garrison on Midway sent out an unencrypted message reporting a broken water plant. Hours later, Japanese intercepts reported that AF is short of water. The deception worked. AF was Midway. Now, for the first time since the start of the war, the Americans knew exactly where and when Japan would strike. At Pacific Fleet Headquarters, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz understood the magnitude of this intelligence. He faced a strategic paradox: act boldly with limited resources or retreat and lose the Central Pacific forever. Nimitz chose to fight. He gambled that surprise and timing could offset Japan's superiority in numbers. The U.S. had only 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, against Japan's 4. Yorktown, damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea, had been expected to take months to repair. But American engineers at Pearl Harbor Naval Yard worked day and night, completing the job in just 72 hours. It was a miracle of urgency, a testament to industrial grit and human will. As May 1942 turned to June, both fleets began to move. Yamamoto's armada stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. 4 carriers, 2 battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and transports. It was one of the largest naval operations in history. Yet its complexity was its weakness. Communications were slow, coordination fragile. Yamamoto, commanding from Yamato, was hundreds of miles behind the action, too distant to influence events once battle began. Meanwhile, Nimitz positioned his carriers northeast of Midway, hidden beyond Japanese reconnaissance range. It was a trap within a trap, both sides convinced the other was walking into their hands. As the final hours of calm passed over the Pacific, the coral sands of Midway were bracing for impact. Marine gunners manned their anti-aircraft batteries. B-17 bombers sat ready on the runway. At 1 a.m., long-range patrols began sweeping the horizon. The tension was thick, invisible, and electric. Everyone knew something massive was coming. They just didn't know when. By dawn on June 3, 1942, the stage was set. The fate of the Pacific would soon hang on radar pings, scouting reports, and the choices of men who had seconds to decide the war's direction. The storm was forming, quietly, methodically, just beyond the horizon. By the first light of June 3, 1942, the ocean east of Midway was deceptively calm. Beneath that mirror surface moved the most formidable naval armadas of the age, 2 fleets invisible to each other, separated by just a few hundred miles but by the vastness of uncertainty. The Japanese First Air Fleet, or Kido Butai, formed the sharp edge of Yamamoto's plan. Its 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carried over 250 aircraft flown by the finest naval aviators in the world. Supporting them were 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and a protective screen of destroyers and submarines stretched in an arc. Their objective was clear: strike Midway, annihilate its defenders, then finish off any American carriers that arrived in response. At the same time, a northern force sailed toward the Aleutian Islands as a diversion. To the Japanese, it was a perfect double blow, a strike north to distract and a decisive battle in the Central Pacific to destroy. But Yamamoto's confidence rested on a fatal assumption, that American carriers were still reacting, not waiting. Across the horizon, Admiral Chester Nimitz had already sprung his counter-trap. Guided by the codebreaker's precision, he placed Task Force 16, Enterprise and Hornet under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Task Force 17, Yorktown under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, northeast of Midway, hidden behind a 360-mile radius of ocean. Nimitz's orders were concise and clear. Inflict maximum damage on the enemy by strong attrition tactics. It was a polite way of saying, ambush them. The Americans had only 3 carriers, fewer aircraft and air crews with limited combat experience, but they held key advantages: intelligence, radar, and home field logistics. Midway itself, though tiny, bristled with firepower. Its sand and coral runways hosted marine fighter squadrons, B-17 flying fortresses, TBF Avengers, and PBY Catalina patrol bombers. It was a fortress disguised as an island, yet the technological contrast between the 2 forces was striking. The Japanese had refined their carrier deck operations into near-clockwork precision: launch, recover, refuel, rearm, cycles timed to the minute. Their pilots were veterans of China and Pearl Harbor, flying the deadly A6M0, D3A Val dive bombers, and B5N Kate torpedo bombers. Against them, American pilots flew slower, less agile F-4F Wildcats and early-generation Dauntless dive bombers. Their torpedoes were unreliable, their training uneven. The odds seemed insurmountable. But war favors not only skill, it favors those who adapt faster. At Midway Atoll, the defense network was alive with vigilance. Catalina flying boats, slow but persistent, patrolled hundreds of miles. On the night of June 3rd, one such patrol sighted a Japanese transport group, the preliminary invasion convoy. Bombers from Midway attacked through the dark, their bombs splashing uselessly into the sea. It was a small, futile gesture, but it told the Americans everything. The Japanese were here. Meanwhile, far to the west, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the Kido Butai, prepared his dawn strike for June 4th. His plan was to hit Midway with full force, soften defenses, land troops, and annihilate American reinforcements. At 4:30 a.m., decks came alive with movement. Armorers loaded torpedoes. Engines roared. By 4:45, the first wave of 108 aircraft rose from the carriers into the blue morning sky. Bound for Midway below deck, ordnance crews worked feverishly to prepare reserve aircraft, some for anti-ship torpedoes, others for follow-up strikes. It was this very flexibility, Nagumo's desire to keep options open, that would soon become his undoing. At the same hour, American search planes fanned out. One Catalina spotted the Japanese main fleet at 5:34 a.m. The transmission was calm, almost understated. Enemy carriers sighted. It was the line that would change history. In Pearl Harbor, Nimitz had taken a gamble. In the skies over Midway, Spruance and Fletcher were about to make it pay. The trap was now in motion, invisible, delicate, and deadly. The sea held its breath as the first Japanese bombs fell on Midway. The defenders returned fire through smoke and flames while American carrier decks stirred to life hundreds of miles away. Engines screamed, flight decks vibrated, and men who had trained for months now climbed into cockpits knowing the odds. It was June 4th, 1942, the day when two mighty fleets would meet for the first time without ever seeing each other's hulls. The world's first true carrier duel was about to begin, and from this point onward, every minute would decide the fate of nations. Long before bombs fell on Midway, the battle had already begun, not in the skies but in the shadows of radio waves. At Station HYPO, deep beneath a nondescript building in Pearl Harbor, cryptanalysts worked under fluorescent light, surrounded by cigarette smoke and coded intercepts. Their leader, Commander Joseph Rochefort, was a quiet man with sharp instincts. His small team, armed with pencils, paper, and intuition, did what no weapon could. They read the enemy's mind. By May 1942, they had cracked enough of the Japanese JN-25 code to know that Operation MI was coming. But without a clear location, their discovery meant little, so Rochefort devised a trap. Midway sent a fake radio message that its water system had failed. Hours later, Japanese communications confirmed that AF is short of water. The deception worked perfectly. This intelligence coup turned the tide before the first shot was fired. The Americans now knew when, where, and roughly how Japan would strike. Yamamoto's intricate plan, once a masterpiece of misdirection, had been rendered transparent. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japan was sailing blind. Information had replaced firepower. The Battle of Midway would be fought not only by aircraft and torpedoes but by men who had never seen the sea. The codebreakers who made every carrier movement count. Their success gave Admiral Nimitz something Yamamoto lacked: clarity. And in war, clarity is power. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz understood risk like few others. He knew the Pacific Fleet could not afford a defeat. Yet he also knew that hesitation would mean surrendering initiative forever. When the codebreakers confirmed the Japanese target, he made a bold choice: to ambush an enemy fleet twice his size. It was not courage born of recklessness, but of precision. Nimitz trusted intelligence over instinct, a revolutionary act for an admiral raised on surface gunnery doctrine. His plan was daring: position the U.S. carriers far enough to remain hidden, yet close enough to strike first once contact was made. Every move would hinge on timing, discipline, and luck. Under him, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a calm, analytical officer with no prior carrier command, replaced the ailing William Bull Halsey. Spruance listened more than he spoke, but when he gave an order, it was absolute. His counterpart, Frank Jack Fletcher, a veteran of Coral Sea, commanded Yorktown with the precision of a chess player. Each man faced impossible choices: launch early and risk losing planes in the void, or wait and risk being found first. Their coordination would decide everything. Theirs was a leadership not of heroism, but of restraint under chaos, a kind of courage the history books rarely glorify, but wars cannot be won without. At Midway, Nimitz, Fletcher, and Spruance didn't outgun their enemy. They outthought him. While admirals gambled on maps, the airmen of the torpedo squadrons faced the raw edge of fate. For them, the battle wasn't strategic. It was personal, violent, and terrifyingly brief. At 0700 hours on June 4th, Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet, led by Lieutenant CMDR John Waldron, launched into the blue without fighter escort. Their outdated TBD Devastators lumbered toward the Japanese fleet, slow, underarmed, and flying at barely 100 knots. Waldron knew what awaited them. 0 fighters, heavy flak, and near certain death, yet they pressed on. One by one, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, elite pilots in nimble A6M, cut through them. Torpedo after torpedo splashed harmlessly into the sea. Within minutes, Waldron's squadron was annihilated. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating in the wreckage for hours, watching history unfold around him. Similar fates met Torpedo 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo 3 from Yorktown. Out of 41 torpedo bombers launched, only 6 returned. It was sacrifice without success, or so it seemed. What no one could see yet was the hidden effect of their courage. Their doomed attack had pulled Japanese fighters low, draining fuel and scattering their formation. Above the chaos, unseen and unopposed, American dive bombers were arriving at altitude. In that suicidal charge, the torpedo pilots had unknowingly paved the way for victory. Their courage was not in killing, but in dying for a moment that others would seize. The Battle of Midway was more than a clash of fleets. It was the dawn of a new kind of warfare. For centuries, naval power had been measured in the thickness of armor and the range of guns. At Midway, everything changed. Carriers replaced battleships and aircraft replaced artillery. The Japanese entered the battle with mastery of carrier doctrine. Their deck crews could arm and launch aircraft with precision measured in seconds. Yet that same precision required perfect information, and at Midway, information failed them. Nagumo's decision to rearm his aircraft for a second strike at Midway left his decks crowded with bombs, fuel lines, and torpedoes exposed. By contrast, the Americans fought with improvisation. Their coordination between squadrons was clumsy, their communications often confused, but they adapted faster. Radar gave them early warning. Their SBD Dauntless dive bombers, though slower than the Japanese Vals, proved deadlier with accurate plunging attacks from altitude. It was not the best machines that won, but those used at the right moment. Midway became the textbook for carrier warfare, timing, intelligence, and air discipline overtaking brute strength. The lesson would echo through every naval battle that followed. Whoever sees first, strikes first, and survives. And as the last of the torpedo planes fell into the sea, fate itself seemed to pause, waiting for the sky above to answer. The next act of this battle would be written not in code or courage alone, but in precision from the clouds. The Pacific Ocean, vast and merciless, was both stage and actor in the Battle of Midway. It gave no favor, no mercy, only the endless horizon and the uncertainty that lived beneath it. To the admirals and pilots alike, the sea was not an ally but an unpredictable weapon. Cloud cover, wind direction, visibility. These invisible elements became the hidden variables of victory. On June 4, 1942, morning squalls formed scattered veils of protection and deception. For some squadrons, clouds masked approach vectors. For others, they obscured the enemy entirely. One misplaced bearing could turn an air group's precision strike into a lonely flight into nothingness. Japanese scouting planes, stretched thin across enormous distances, missed key sightings by minutes. One delayed launch, a reconnaissance aircraft from the cruiser Tone, would alter the fate of 4 carriers. That plane's late report describing 10 enemy ships reached Admiral Nagumo too late to act decisively. He had already begun rearming his aircraft for a second strike on Midway, unaware that American carriers were close enough to strike him first. Meanwhile, the Americans wrestled with the same geography. Task Force 16 and 17 maneuvered under strict radio silence. Pilots navigated by compass headings, horizon lines, and instinct. Even small errors could send them hundreds of miles off course, and many never returned. At Midway, nature wasn't neutral. It amplified hesitation, punished precision, and rewarded the side that adapted to uncertainty. In that endless expanse of blue, seconds stretched into eternity. The sea itself became the silent judge of human calculation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, was both visionary and realist. He had warned Japan's leaders before the war, "For 6 months I can run wild. After that, I cannot guarantee success. He understood the balance between surprise and sustainability, and Midway would test that prophecy. Yamamoto's plan for Operation MI was audacious, perhaps too much so. It depended on flawless timing, perfect communication, and the assumption that the enemy would react, not anticipate. The Japanese fleet stretched across thousands of miles, divided into multiple groups with no central coordination once battle began. In a war of signals and seconds, Yamamoto's fleet moved like an orchestra, with the conductor a hemisphere away. At the tactical level, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the Kido Butai, faced impossible decisions. At 7:15 a.m., as the first wave returned from Midway, reconnaissance spotted enemy ships. But details were missing. Were they carriers, cruisers? The message was ambiguous. Nagumo hesitated. His doctrine demanded readiness for counterstrike, yet his decks were filled with aircraft being refueled and rearmed for another land attack. Bombs, torpedoes, and gasoline cluttered the hangars in a lethal mix. Nagumo could have launched immediately with what he had ready, half his air power, or waited to rearm for a coordinated blow. He chose to wait. In that pause, destiny arrived. While Japanese deck crews worked feverishly to rearm planes below deck, American squadrons were climbing into position above the clouds. The same meticulous efficiency that had made the Kido Butai invincible now rendered it immobile, vulnerable, a trap of its own making. Yamamoto's vision, brilliant in conception, failed in execution because it underestimated one factor: the adaptability of his enemy. Intelligence, weather, and timing, all small cracks interaligned into catastrophe. At Midway, Japan met not just the U.S. Navy, but its own reflection. Boldness without balance, planning without flexibility. War, at its core, is a contest of will. But at Midway, it was also a test of humanity. Behind every signal intercept and aerial formation were men making impossible decisions under unimaginable pressure. For the Japanese pilots, Midway was meant to be another glorious victory, a reaffirmation of the Empire's invincibility. Many of them had trained together for years, elite warriors who had flown at Pearl Harbor and Ceylon, believing utterly in their mission. They took off that morning with confidence, not arrogance. When they failed to return, Japan lost not only its carriers but its most experienced air crews, men who could never be replaced. For the Americans, it was different. Midway was not fought from strength but desperation. The pilots who rose from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown knew the odds and flew anyway. Some were barely out of flight school. Others had seen comrades die in Coral Sea just weeks before. Their courage was not born of superiority but of necessity, the grim awareness that if they didn't stop Japan here, there might be no later chance. When historians describe the turning point, they often speak of tactics, ships, and numbers. But Midway's true turning point was psychological. The illusion of Japanese invincibility shattered. The myth of American inferiority dissolved. Both nations, in their own way, confronted the cost of overconfidence and the limits of endurance. What remained was respect, bitter, unspoken, but lasting. Even among enemies, the courage at Midway stood beyond hatred. Every war has its what-ifs, and at Midway they were countless. What if the Japanese scout plane had launched on time? What if the American dive bombers had arrived 10 minutes later? What if Yorktown's radar had failed? Or if one bomb had struck an elevator instead of the deck? Each question reveals how fragile victory truly was. The Battle of Midway was not destiny. It was a cascade of coincidences, errors, and instincts converging into one pivotal hour. Historians often speak of luck at Midway, but luck favors preparation. The Americans were ready to seize the chance when it came. They turned randomness into opportunity, chaos into calculation. The lesson, written across the smoking decks of 4 Japanese carriers, was that even the most powerful fleet can fall to the smallest moment, a missed message, a gust of wind, a fraction of time. And in that truth lies the soul of Midway. Not a story of triumph alone, but a reminder of how close the world came to a different ending. The angles converge now: intelligence, leadership, courage, and chance, forming the lens through which the decisive moment will erupt. The next scene would unfold in less than 6 minutes and change the Pacific War forever. June 4, 1942. Midway Atoll, 0430 hours. Engines thunder across the dawn sky as the first Japanese strike wave approaches the island. The sunlight turns the sea into a mirror of fire, reflecting the metallic wings of 108 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, all aimed at crushing Midway's defenses. From the island's sandbagged bunkers, Marines brace behind anti-aircraft guns. The radar station at Midway blinks alive. Many bogies, bearing 320, distance 150 miles. Sirens howl across the atoll. Ground crews scramble. Pilots sprint for their cockpits. In minutes, the island becomes a storm of motion and fear. At 0620, the Japanese formation dives. Explosions tear through fuel tanks and hangars. The sky fills with tracer fire and black bursts of flak. Japanese bombs detonate along the runways, shattering coral, twisting metal. A B-17 bursts into flames. The island trembles. Yet Midway holds Marine anti-aircraft crews, though outgunned, refuse to falter. Their shells rip through formation lines. Several bombers disintegrate mid-air. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant Tomonaga Joichi, radios Nagumo. Runways damaged but operational. Another attack necessary. That single message, another attack necessary, unseals Japan's fate. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stands at the center of the Kido Butai's operations room. His situation is fluid, dangerous, and uncertain. The first strike has hit Midway, but it has not destroyed it. His returning aircraft need recovery. His decks are filled with refueling, rearming, and wounded planes. At 0715, a scout plane from the cruiser Tone sends a vague report. Enemy ships sighted. Nagumo's staff freezes. Are they cruisers? Destroyers, carriers? The answer doesn't come. Nagumo now faces an impossible decision. Should he launch his reserve aircraft immediately, armed with bombs for a second strike on Midway, or rearm them with torpedoes to strike ships that might be near? Every moment of hesitation costs time. Every minute of rearming exposes his decks to catastrophe. He waits for confirmation. The minutes slip away. Below deck, mechanics drain fuel lines, swap warheads, and move torpedoes by hand. The hangars are hot, crowded, and volatile, full of high explosives and open fuel lines. The carrier's greatest strength, their coordination, has become a lethal vulnerability. At 0755, the scout's full message finally arrives. Enemy force includes carriers. The words cut like steel. The hunters have become the hunted. Far to the east, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise receives the scout report from Midway. Enemy carriers sighted. He wastes no time. At 07 he orders his air groups to launch, even without perfect coordinates. It is a decision driven not by certainty but by instinct. Strike first. The American strike force forms in the sky, a patchwork of dauntless dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and wildcat fighters. They take off in staggered groups, each searching for the enemy across hundreds of miles of ocean. Many never find their target. At 0755, Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet under Lieutenant CMDR John Waldron finds the Japanese fleet. They dive to wave-top altitude and line up for attack. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol and Zero fighters descend like hawks. Within minutes, Waldron's entire squadron is wiped out. Only Ensign George Gay survives, floating amid the wreckage. Moments later, Torpedo 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo 3 from Yorktown attack in succession. They too are slaughtered. Out of 41 torpedo bombers, only 6 return. Not a single torpedo finds its mark. But in death, they achieve what radar and strategy could not. They drag every Japanese fighter down to sea level, forcing the enemy's air cover out of position. Above them, unseen in the sunlight, the sky is clear for the next wave. At 10:20 a.m., the first American dive bombers, SBD Dauntlesses from Enterprise and Yorktown, approach the Japanese fleet. Led by Commander Wade McCluskey, they had nearly run out of fuel after hours of searching. Then McCluskey spots a lone Japanese destroyer speeding north, Arashi, racing to rejoin the fleet after chasing a submarine. He follows it. The decision saves the war. Following Arashi's wake, the bombers break through the clouds and find the Kido Butai, 4 Japanese carriers, decks packed with fueled aircraft, their crews rushing to rearm. It is the most vulnerable moment in naval warfare, and it lasts only minutes. At 10:22, Enterprise's dive bombers dive. From 20,000 feet they fall like arrows. Bombs scream downward at 250 knots. In seconds, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu erupt in flames. Fuel lines ignite. Torpedoes detonate on the decks. Bombs pierce hangars, sending chain reactions of explosions through the ship's hearts. Men leap into the sea, their uniforms ablaze. Decks buckle. Flight crews vanish into the inferno. The Japanese fleet, and proud, disciplined, unmatched, and is torn apart in the space of 5 minutes. 3 carriers hit. 3 carriers burning, crackles the radio aboard Enterprise. Spruance listens in silence, knowing history is shifting beneath him. By 10:30, the Pacific is a furnace, smoke towers miles into the sky. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the same ships that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, are mortally wounded. Their burning silhouettes mark the end of Japan's dominance. Only Hiryu remains, her decks intact, her spirit unbroken. From her bridge, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi swears to strike back. He orders immediate retaliation against the American carriers. The battle is not yet over. The sea still burns, but vengeance is on the wind. The air above the Pacific is a blackened storm of smoke and fuel vapor. 3 of Japan's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, lie burning, their decks warped and twisted by relentless explosions. The Kido Butai, once the spearhead of the Japanese Empire, is now a floating graveyard, but one ship still fights. Far to the north, Hiryu, under the command of Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, remains untouched. On her deck, chaos is replaced by grim order. Yamaguchi, resolute and expressionless, issues his command. Prepare to launch. Find their carriers. At 10:50 a.m., the first counterstrike lifts from Hiryu's flight deck. 18 dive bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. They climb into the sunlight, heading toward the American fleet. Below, on USS Yorktown, radar operators detect the incoming wave. Sirens wail. Enemy aircraft inbound! The carrier's decks explode into motion. Crews man anti-aircraft guns. Gunners load ammunition belts. Damage control teams brace for impact. At 12 CAUG noon, the dive bombers appear, sharp, silver shapes descending from the sun. The first bomb hits Yorktown's flight deck, penetrating through to the hangar level. A second bomb detonates near the island structure. Flames engulf the control tower. The third bomb strikes amidships. Smoke pours into the sky. Fires rage through the corridors, yet the crew refuses to abandon ship. By 12:40, through superhuman effort, Yorktown's damage control teams extinguish the fires. The ship, though wounded, still moves under her own power. Then from Hiryu comes the second wave. At 14:30, 10 torpedo bombers from Hiryu arrive, low and fast. American fighters intercept, but not all can break through. 2 torpedoes find their mark, slamming into Yorktown's port side. The explosions lift the carrier's hull out of the water. Power dies. The great ship lists heavily to port. Admiral Fletcher, realizing she can no longer fight, transfers his flag to Astoria. The order is given to abandon ship. For hours, lifeboats and destroyers pick up the wounded as Yorktown's deck tilts ever further into the sea. By dusk, Yorktown, the veteran of Coral Sea, lies crippled, but she has done her duty. Her sacrifice and the men who fought aboard her draw out Hiryu's remaining air groups. Leaving the last Japanese carrier exposed, Spruance and McCluskey seize the moment. At 15:30, reconnaissance planes from Enterprise spot a lone carrier fleeing north, smoke trailing faintly across the horizon. Hiryu, the last sword of the Kido Butai. Spruance wastes no time. He orders a full strike. 24 SBD Dauntless dive bombers roar into the sky. The sun is low, the sea golden. As they approach, Hiryu's crew braces for the inevitable. At 17, the Dauntlesses dive. The first bomb smashes through Hiryu's flight deck, detonating among refueled planes. A second explodes near the bridge. The third hits amidships, splitting open the hangar deck. The fourth ignites aviation fuel below deck. The ship becomes an inferno within seconds. Flames consume the carrier from bow to stern. Sailors jump into the sea, their uniforms aflame, their faces ghostly in the reflection of the fire. Admiral Yamaguchi, refusing evacuation, remains aboard with Captain Kaku. When offered a chance to abandon ship, he replies quietly, "I will go down with my ship and my men." As night falls, Hiryu drifts, burning against the horizon like a dying star. At 02:00 a.m., she finally explodes, her magazines detonating in a single blinding flash. The last of Japan's 4 carriers is gone. By midnight, the Pacific has fallen eerily silent. Smoke trails fade into the stars. The surface glows faintly from fires still burning miles away. Wreckage drifts, oil slicks, twisted steel bodies. The sea that had echoed with engines all day now murmurs softly, indifferent once more. On the bridge of Enterprise, Admiral Spruance stands quietly, eyes fixed on the horizon. Around him, exhausted crewmen whisper of what they've witnessed. A miracle, a slaughter, a turning point. He knows the battle is not yet officially over, but its outcome is already written in the flames. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed. 1 American carrier lost. The balance of the Pacific forever altered. When dawn rises on June 5, 1942, what remains of the Kido Butai limps westward under escort. The pride of Japan's Navy, its elite air crews, its invincible formation, has been annihilated in a single day. Messages sent to Tokyo are clinical, understated, tragic. Losses heavy, situation critical. The once glorious fleet that had bombed Pearl Harbor now retreats beneath gray skies, carrying the wounded, the dying, and the ghosts of its own arrogance. In Pearl Harbor, Nimitz receives the victory report. His response is brief and emotionless, and not triumph but relief. He knows this is only the beginning of a longer, bloodier path, but for the first time in 6 months, Japan has been stopped. The tide at last has turned. The Pacific is still burning, but the momentum of the war has shifted, irrevocably. The aftermath of Midway will reveal the true price of this victory, not just in ships and men, but in the psychology of empires. When the sun rose on June 5, 1942, the Pacific was unrecognizable. The ocean that had once echoed with Japan's supremacy now floated with debris. Lifeboats, oil slicks, the shattered fragments of 4 great carriers. The smoke still hung low across the horizon, drifting like a dark shroud over the water. The Battle of Midway was over. In less than 24 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered a defeat from which it would never recover. 4 of its 6 frontline fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were gone. Each carried not only planes but men, hundreds of trained aviators, deck crews, and maintenance specialists. They were Japan's finest, the product of years of disciplined training and experience. And they were irreplaceable. The numerical losses told one story. The human cost told another. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen perished in the flames in the sea. The U.S. Navy, by comparison, lost around 307 men, a tragic number but small beside the scale of Japan's losses. The contrast reflected more than luck. It showed how thoroughly Japan's offensive power had been broken in a single blow. On the American side, victory came at a price. The USS Yorktown, the veteran of the Coral Sea, had survived 2 bombings and 2 torpedo hits before finally being abandoned. For nearly 2 days she drifted upright, stubbornly refusing to sink, a ghost ship still proud under her flag. Crews from the destroyer USS Hamon worked tirelessly to save her, but on June 6th, a Japanese submarine, I-168, slipped through the destroyer screen and struck again. 2 torpedoes ripped through Hamon, breaking her in half. Seconds later, the depth charges aboard her detonated, killing dozens of sailors in the water. Another torpedo hit Yorktown herself, finishing what Midway's air battle had begun. The carrier rolled slowly to starboard and finally capsized, disappearing beneath the waves at dawn on June 7th. Her loss was mourned deeply, but it could not overshadow what had been achieved. Yorktown's sacrifice had bought the time and distraction needed to locate and destroy Hiryu, and, in doing so, had preserved the Pacific Fleet's balance. For Admiral Nimitz, the victory was both strategic and symbolic. It proved that information and preparation could overcome numerical superiority. It was the triumph of discipline over arrogance, of calculated risk over blind expansion. In his post-battle report, Nimitz summarized the scale of the reversal with characteristic understatement. Pearl Harbor avenged. At the same time, in Tokyo, disbelief turned to grief, and then to silence. The Imperial General Headquarters initially censored the truth, reporting only that a fierce battle had been fought near Midway. But within naval circles, the devastation was undeniable. The loss of so many experienced aviators crippled Japan's ability to wage carrier warfare. No amount of shipbuilding could replace the pilots, deck officers, and flight crews who had vanished beneath the sea. In a culture where honor often outweighed survival, the psychological shock was immense. For the first time, the illusion of invincibility, the myth of the unstoppable Japanese fleet, was shattered. The nation's expansion, once fueled by confidence and momentum, now faced the chilling reality of defeat. Meanwhile, on Midway Atoll, the small garrison that had endured the first attack began to bury its dead. Wrecked hangars smoldered, coral runways were cratered, and burned-out aircraft lined the shore. Yet among the ruins there was pride. They had held. Their defense had bought the time the carriers needed to strike. Across the Pacific, word of victory spread slowly but steadily. In San Francisco, Pearl Harbor survivors cheered. In Washington, Roosevelt called it our first clear victory in the Pacific. But the celebrations were tempered by exhaustion. The war was far from over, and everyone knew it. Still, for the first time since December 1941, hope returned to the Allied world. Midway had proved that the tide could be turned, that courage, codebreaking, and timing could stand against might. The wrecks of the Japanese carriers burned for days before slipping beneath the waves. And in their fiery descent, they carried with them not only the best of Japan's fleet, but the momentum of its empire. The shockwaves of Midway reached far beyond the Pacific horizon. What had begun as a desperate gamble by Admiral Nimitz now stood as one of the most decisive naval victories in history. Its consequences reshaped not only fleets and strategies, but the very psychology of the Second World War. For Japan, the defeat at Midway marked the end of offensive expansion. Until that moment, the Imperial Navy had dictated the tempo of the war, choosing where and when to strike. After Midway, it would never again seize the initiative. Four of its most powerful carriers, the heart of its striking arm, lay at the bottom of the Pacific. But even more devastating was the loss of its aviators, the elite pilots who had honed their skills since the 1930s in China and the South Pacific. Training replacements would take years. Japan's naval flight schools were efficient, but not fast enough to replenish hundreds of combat-experienced men. When the U.S. launched its counteroffensives later that year, in the Solomon Islands and Guadalcanal, Japan was forced to fill cockpits with rookies who lacked combat endurance. Midway had done more than destroy ships. It had dismantled Japan's irreplaceable human capital. At the strategic level, the Imperial Navy's structure itself began to fracture. Confidence in Admiral Yamamoto's grand strategy waned. Though his authority remained intact for the time being, the aura of infallibility that surrounded him evaporated. The once invincible Kido Butai, the symbol of Japan's modern naval power, had been erased in a single day. In contrast, the United States Navy was reborn from the ashes of Pearl Harbor. The victory at Midway reversed 6 months of humiliation and despair. It gave the American people proof that the tide of war could change, and that courage, intelligence, and resolve could overcome even the most staggering odds. The names of the ships and men who fought there became symbols: Enterprise, Yorktown, Spruance, McCluskey, Rochefort. In Washington, the strategic implications became clear almost immediately. With Japan's carrier strength broken, the United States could now move from defense to offense. Plans that had been theoretical, the island-hopping campaigns across the Central Pacific, now seemed achievable. Factories on the American mainland were already rolling out new carriers faster than Japan could replace its losses. Within 2 years, the U.S. Navy would outnumber and outgun its opponent, by a margin Japan could never match. Midway also redefined the nature of naval warfare itself. Never before had two fleets fought without a single ship from either side seeing the other. It was a battle of reconnaissance, air coordination, and timing, the first pure carrier battle in history. The lesson was unmistakable. The era of the battleship was over. Air power, not armor, would decide the future of the seas. For the officers who survived Midway, the psychological effect was profound. American pilots who had once doubted themselves now carried a new confidence into every mission. The myth of Japanese invincibility, born at Pearl Harbor, had been broken. Yet for all the triumph, Midway also revealed the brutal cost of victory. The torpedo squadrons that had charged fearlessly into annihilation became the unsung martyrs of the Pacific War. Their sacrifice, unrecorded in headlines, had cleared the sky for the decisive blow. For the Japanese survivors, Midway was not merely defeat, it was disillusionment. Many of the men rescued from the burning carriers spoke of shock more than sorrow. They had believed in their fleet's perfection, its divine purpose. Midway shattered that belief. It replaced confidence with doubt, and from that doubt came the slow unraveling of Japan's naval spirit. As the months passed, American dominance in the Pacific grew. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan would follow, each a step closer to Tokyo, each made possible by the turning of the tide at Midway. But even as Japan retreated, Admiral Nimitz remained cautious. He knew the road ahead would be long and bloody. Midway was not the end of the war, he later said, but the beginning of our hope, and a new kind of war. The fleets had withdrawn, the wrecks had sunk, but the consequences of Midway rippled outward, shaping strategy, morale, and destiny. It was no longer just a battle. It was a hinge of history. In the quiet after Midway, the Pacific returned to its deceptive calm. Waves rolled gently over the graves of men and machines, over the twisted metal of the Kido Butai, over the silence left behind by courage and catastrophe. The sea, indifferent as ever, carried on, but history had changed course. Midway was more than a naval engagement. It was a revelation of what modern war had become, a war of signals, strategy, and seconds. The battle proved that knowledge could be as deadly as firepower, and that courage could be measured not only in victory, but in the willingness to face annihilation for the slightest chance of turning the tide. For the Japanese, it was the first tremor of defeat, the moment when expansion met resistance and ambition met reality. For the Americans, it was redemption, not in triumphalism but in endurance. The same fleet battered at Pearl Harbor had risen again, sharper, smarter, and unwilling to yield. Midway taught that wars are not won by numbers alone. They are decided by decisions, small human choices made under impossible pressure. Rochefort's insistence on a code fragment, McCluskey's decision to follow a destroyer's wake, Spruance's command to launch early, Waldron's doomed torpedo run. Every thread of the battle was a choice, and together they rewove the fabric of history. In that sense, Midway was both victory and warning. It showed how brilliance and error, heroism and chance intertwine until the line between fate and decision disappears. When the smoke finally cleared, and the Pacific fell silent again, the balance of the Second World War had shifted forever. The empire that had begun the conflict in triumph would now fight a war of retreat. The nation that had begun it in despair would carry the hope of eventual victory. On the waves around Midway, no monuments mark the exact places where men died. The ocean itself is their memorial, vast, indifferent, eternal. But beneath that silence lies a truth that endures, that in the midst of chaos, courage and clarity can still change the course of the world. The tides of fire had turned,